In my last lecture, I talked about the birth of the modern conservative movement in the 1970s. I covered the backlash against liberal policies like high property taxes and busing and affirmative action. And then I explained what conservatives wanted to do once in office: to cut taxes, support the army and the police, and bring religion back into politics. So in essence, marry old-style country club conservatism, the one that catered to the rich and corporations with tax cuts, with a newer style of conservatism inherited from the cultural wars of the 60s and 70s, which would be about throwing red meat at the base. What we'll do today is look at what happened in practice, which conservatives were elected at the polls, and what they did once they were in power. I'll proceed chronologically, starting with the 80s and 90s, mostly Ronald Reagan, and then moving on to the 2000s, i.e. W and the Donald. So first question, does that modern conservative agenda get people elected? And to a large extent, the answer is yes, at least after the 1980s. In the class, I mentioned Barry Goldwater, that senator from Arizona who was the GOP's candidate for president in 1964. I mentioned him in passing because he was trounced by Lyndon Johnson in that election that year, in part because Goldwater was too keen on using nuclear bombs and he scared people. But the ideas of Goldwater, which were considered very extreme for his time, they anticipated what later became the mainstream of the Republican Party: opposition to welfare and to civil rights, support for religion, and law and order. Another person we studied in the class was George Cornwallis, the governor of Alabama, who ran for president repeatedly from 64 to 76. He too failed to get a majority, in part because he was too associated with racism and segregation, and also he was shot in that 72 campaign. But Governor Wallace put together a package that also resembled the modern conservative program: anti-welfare, pro-police, anti-intellectual, pro-religion. So think of him as a precursor. We also studied Richard Nixon, who actually managed to be elected president in 68 and 72, but he doesn't fit the model of a modern conservative because he was quite progressive on some issues like the environment, the EPA, the Clean Air Act. Also, he was an unlikable crook who resigned in disgrace, so not the perfect embodiment of modern conservatism. The key to success, then, would be to take the ideas pioneered by Goldwater and Wallace and repackage them in a way that would be more appealing to a mainstream audience. Maybe abandon racial slurs like the N-word and use dog whistles instead. And dog whistles are a technique where you still attack black people, but you use code words like welfare queens or super predators. So when criticizing welfare, you use a black woman as an example welfare fraud. Or when recommending tougher sentencing, you'll use a scary-looking black dude as the poster child for violent crime. People will understand what you mean, wink wink, but you're not actually saying out loud that black people are lazy and violent, the way Wallace used to do in public. Or, even better, you find an ideal candidate that would project an image of sunny optimism, a candidate who would borrow the ideas of Goldwater and Wallace, but then present them in a way that was less threatening to a mainstream audience. And that's where Ronald Reagan comes in. Nowadays, Reagan has become the patron saint of the Republican Party, so it's easy to forget how controversial he was when he began running for president in the 70s. He was considered way too far to the right for the party of Eisenhower and Rockefeller. But Reagan eventually succeeded in getting the nomination in 1980, in part because of his personal charm, but also because of diplomatic setbacks like the Iran hostage crisis and generally the terrible economic situation under the presidency of Jimmy Carter. So Reagan was elected president in 1980 and re-elected in 1984, and that made him the first Republican to complete 2 terms since Eisenhower. Part of Reagan's success was to portray himself as a patriot. Remember how respect for the flag, that is a big wedge issue in modern conservatism. Notice in that photo that not only is Reagan wearing a red, white, and blue tie, but he also has a little flag in his hand, and in the back he has a picture of the American West with yet another American flag. He's fully dressed, but I'm pretty sure that if you took off his pants, he would have red, white, and blue underwear as well. So wrap yourself in the flag, literally. Or hump it, as some other conservative presidents have been known to do. Reagan was also gifted at projecting optimism. He talked about bringing morning in America. After all the crises of the 70s, he'd get America out of its funk. And the mood in the 80s under him was generally more optimistic. In a previous lecture, I mentioned that the movies from the 70s, like Network, they tended to be dark and gritty. Iconic movies of the 80s, by contrast, like Wall Street and Top Gun or Risky Business, they're all about unbridled capitalism and gung-ho patriotism. America is back, baby. Way out of the danger zone. Reagan was very good at projecting his sunny image because he was a professional. Literally, his day job before entering politics was acting. He had a career as a B-movie star in Hollywood and then as a spokesman for General Electric. He had the great ability to convey complex ideas in simple, reassuring phrases. His nickname was the Great Communicator. So think of JFK in the 1960 presidential debate or FDR in his fireside chats. So all that is about style. But now let's move on to substance. Reagan's policies, they were in line with the conservative agenda that I defined last time. So first, reduce the size of government, which I'd expanded a lot in the 60s and 70s. Famously, in his 1980 inaugural address, which is in your workbook, Reagan said that, quote, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem, unquote. Another great one-liner by Reagan was, quote, the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I am from the government and I am here to help, unquote. In practice, this means that Reagan dramatically cut taxes for the rich. You can see from this graph that the marginal income tax rate, which is the one that the richest people pay, had been as high as 90% during World War II and then remained quite high in the 60s and 70s at around 70%. Reagan, a well-paid actor and spokesman, knew it personally because, well, he was in that tax bracket. Well, the marginal rate, the one paid by the richest Americans, dropped down to 28% during his presidency, as you can see in the graph, so it was cut by 2/3 under Reagan. What was the result? Remember that according to the Laffer curve that we studied last time, bringing tax rates down from prohibitive levels should be revenue neutral. Economic growth will be so great that tax cuts will pay for themselves. That was a promise, but that was not the case in practice. The federal deficit widened, in part also because Reagan spent a lot of money on defense as well, as modern conservatives are prone to do. The economy did quite well overall, so that was economic growth, though the economy also did very well in the 90s when George Bush and Bill Clinton raised taxes, so it's not clear if the Reagan boom of the 80s was connected to his tax cuts or some other development. One clear consequence of Reagan's tax policies was a widening gap between the richest and the poorest. What you see on that graph is how much money goes to the top 1% of Americans. So if the line is high, it means rich people get a lot of the national wealth, and there is high inequality. That was the case around 1910, coming out of the Gilded Age, and again in the 1920s after the tax cuts of Andrew Mellon. If the line is low, by contrast, it means that rich people get a smaller share of the national wealth, and you have greater equality between the rich and poor. And that was the case during the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, at a time when the marginal tax rate was high and American prosperity was more widely shared. Notice though how inequality skyrocketed after the Reagan tax cuts in the 1980s. That's because the stock market boomed during that period and rich people make the bulk of their income from stocks. And then they got to keep a lot of those profits in the stock market because the tax rates went down under Reagan. We'll see the same dynamic when we get to the Bush tax cuts and the Trump tax cuts because they also resulted in a high deficit and rising inequality. None of that affected Reagan's popularity. He was easily reelected in 1984. Here's a little test to check if you have good eyes. Can you spot the states that went Democratic on that 1984 electoral map when Reagan was reelected? Well, that would be Minnesota, the home state of Democratic candidate Walter Mondale, and ultra-liberal D.C., and that's about it. Talk about a Republican landslide. Reagan also managed to ride out a major scandal called Iran-Contra. It's a complicated scandal linked to the crisis in Iran, which I covered in another video lecture, but in essence, the underlings of Reagan, or maybe the president himself, it's not clear how directly Reagan was involved, they illegally sold weapons to Iran, which by that point was a major foe of the United States, so that they could use that money to ship money and weapons, again, illegally, to the Contras, who were an anti-communist guerrilla group in Nicaragua, to overthrow the government there. So it was doubly illegal, and that could easily have turned into a second coming of Watergate, the scandal that doomed Nixon's presidency. But somehow Reagan escaped unscathed to the point where people spoke of him as the Teflon president. You could throw everything at him and nothing stuck because he looked like a nice guy. Reagan was popular enough that his vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, was elected in 1988 by riding his coattails. Bush Sr. is mostly remembered for his foreign policy. He successfully navigated the end of the Cold War when the Soviet Union imploded in 1989 to 1991, and that brought an end to a conflict that had preoccupied U.S. policymakers for decades. Bush Sr. also masterminded the U.S. victory over Iraq in 1991, the first Gulf War, which was a one-sided triumph that did a lot to erase the trauma from the U.S. defeat in Vietnam. One document we read in the class was Eisenhower's farewell address, his warning that the U.S. was spending too much for too long on defense, and that a military-industrial complex would make it impossible to rein in the defense budget over the long run. Well, that warning by Eisenhower was prescient. When the Cold War ended under President Bush Sr., you'd think that the defense budget would be slashed, but in practice it only dipped a bit and then resumed its march upward to the point where the U.S. now spends as much on defense as the next 10 countries combined, even though the country is at peace. So that's one major difference between modern conservatives who love to spend a lot on defense in war or in peace, and their predecessors who hated the notion of a large standing army in peacetime and were skimpy when it came to the defense budget. Bush Sr. made one major political mistake. He agreed to raise taxes to balance the budget, which is a major taboo for the modern Republican Party. His promise when campaigning for office had been, "Read my lips, no new taxes." So when Bush betrayed that promise and raised taxes, even for a good reason like balancing the budget, that was enough to make him a one-term president. Democrats, as a result, finally made it back to the White House in 1993, but overall the 1990s were still a fairly conservative decade. The Democratic president, Bill Clinton, he embraced triangulation, i.e. borrowing conservative ideas and making them his own. And also for most of his presidency, the House of Representatives was dominated by Newt Gingrich, one of the arch-conservatives of the modern Republican Party, so President Clinton could not have passed major liberal measures even if he had wanted to. The only truly progressive goal of Clinton was to create a national health care program, but he and his wife could not get it through Congress. What did go through Congress was a crime bill that dramatically increased prison times, i.e. the very kind of law and order measures promoted by Republicans. That crime bill passed in the 90s has remained controversial ever since. Remember how drug use and crime had gone up a lot in the 70s, so crime obviously was a major concern for voters in the 80s and 90s. Crime went down after the 1990s and has remained low ever since, so some scholars credit the Clinton crime bill and tougher prison sentences for all that progress, but the evidence is not entirely conclusive, so it's still being debated. One sure consequence of tougher crime policies was the ballooning number of people who were incarcerated. By international standards, the U.S. puts way more people in prison than other countries do, and for much longer periods of time. And that's especially true in Louisiana, where I live. Men, and especially black men, are sent to prison at much higher rates too, which has led to complaints that the judicial system is much harsher for some people than for others. In the 80s and 90s, for example, crack cocaine, a very black inner city kind of drug, was punished much more harshly under the law than powder cocaine, the stereotypical white Wall Street trader drug of choice, even though the two of them are very similar hard drugs. There's also a concern about all the taxpayer money spent on those prisons, which can be greater in some states than the money spent on, well, universities where I teach, for example. So recently there's been a pushback against the tough on crime policies of the 1990s, especially for non-violent offenses like buying pot, which is not even a crime anymore in many states. Let's now switch slides and centuries and move on to the next Republican on our list, George W. Bush, who was, you guessed it, the son of former President George H.W. Bush. The younger Bush was a bit more moderate on some social issues, promoting education, for example, and expanding Medicare coverage for the elderly. But aside from that, he was a typical conservative who loved to spend more on defense and in fact began two major wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. The first war was legitimate payback for the 9/11 terrorist attacks. As you all know, maybe don't if you're a 20-year-old college student, on September 11th of 2001, a terrorist group named Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 airplanes and crashed 2 of them on the World Trade Center in New York City, and 1 of them on the Pentagon near Washington, D.C., while the 4th one crashed in a field when the passengers fought back. May they rest in peace. That terrorist group, Al-Qaeda, was housed by the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, so it was perfectly legitimate for the US under Bush to attack Afghanistan in response. By the way, do you remember NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization? This is the defensive military alliance that the US just founded after World War II. The central aspect of NATO, Article 5 of the treaty, states that if one member of that alliance, NATO, is attacked, all countries that are members of the alliance must rush to its rescue. The idea back in 1949, when the alliance was founded, was to deter the Soviet Union. Communist Russia would be less likely to attack France or Italy if it knew that this would invite an automatic response from the US military under Article 5. Well, NATO was so effective at deterrence that it never had to intervene during the Cold War. The Russians never attacked. So the only time Article 5 was ever triggered was in 2001, after the US was attacked by Al-Qaeda. Again, the initial goal of NATO was for the US to help European countries if they were attacked by Communist Russia, but in the end it was European allies like France or the UK that sent troops to Afghanistan to assist the US in its war there. A little digression, if I may. I am taping this segment in 2025 and NATO is currently in poor shape. Russia, under dictator Putin, is resurgent and actually attacking Eastern Europe, i.e. Ukraine. But the current US president is siding with Putin and Russia, of all people. It's too soon to tell, but that seems like a major long-term reversal of long-standing US policy. Ronald Reagan must be rolling around in his grave. End of digression. Back to George W. Bush. His war in Afghanistan failed in some important respects. The Bush administration failed to capture Osama bin Laden, the head of Al-Qaeda, so he was later killed in a raid during the Obama administration. More importantly, the US got bogged down in a long and inconclusive war in Afghanistan that lasted for 24 years until US troops evacuated under the Biden administration in 2021 in a somewhat chaotic manner that resembled the evacuation from Saigon at the end of the Vietnam War. And the Taliban are now back in power in Afghanistan. I guess there's a reason why this country is known as the, quote, graveyard of the empires. But back to the Bush administration in the early 2000s. The second main war that Bush launched after Afghanistan was in Iraq, and that war was far more controversial. George Bush claimed that the dictator of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, had stockpiled weapons of mass destruction like chemical bombs or even nuclear bombs, and that he was planning to use them against the US. His administration even hinted that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11 somehow. As it turned out, both of these claims were lies. Saddam Hussein did not plan 9/11. Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, Osama bin Laden did. And Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction. Whoops, we invaded the wrong country. Both George Bush and his Vice President Dick Cheney were veterans of the oil industry, so I guess their friends made money as a result of the war, at least. As president, Bush also pushed through another major tax cut. No big surprise there. Support for the military and tax cuts are two cornerstones of the modern Republican Party. Just like previous tax cuts in the 1920s and 80s, that tax cut was skewed toward the wealthy and especially income from stocks. Stock sales, or the profit from those, were taxed at a flat rate of 15%, no matter how rich you were, instead of maybe upward of 30%. So, as a result, a man like Warren Buffett, a financier who is one of the richest men on the planet, paid a smaller share of his income as taxes than his secretary did, because wages were taxed more than stock income, and they still are. By the way, there are ways to reduce your tax rate even further than those 15% if you have a good accountant. When Mitt Romney, a multi-millionaire, ran for president on the Republican ticket in 2012, it turned out that his effective tax rate was somewhere around 10% because he used a variety of tax shelters overseas. Donald Trump, a billionaire with a B, who ran in 2016 and 2020 and 2024, refused outright to release his income tax forms, but the few pages that were leaked showed that by claiming large losses on his businesses, his tax rate was effectively 0%. So overall, between the Reagan tax cuts and the later Bush and even later Trump tax cuts, there was a sharp drop in the income tax rates for the rich from a high of 90% after World War II to 28% under Reagan, and then 15 or 10 or even effectively 0 nowadays for some very rich people. Those tax cuts did not have the expected economic benefits. Because of the immediate instant sugar high, the economy popped, especially the housing market and Wall Street in the early 2000s, but the deficit ballooned, and eventually the bubble burst, and by the time George Bush left office in 2008 or 9, the US was in a major economic crisis known as the Great Recession. And by the way, the same thing happened under Donald Trump's first term in 2016-2020. He also left behind a major economic crisis and a ballooning deficit. So COVID may have had something to do with it as well. Clearly, tax cuts don't pay for themselves, so some Republican think tanks have now abandoned the Laffer curve altogether and redefined their goal as, quote, starving the beast. Here's how it works. First, you cut taxes, a lot. That creates a big artificial deficit, and the minute this happens, it is easier to go back to the public and say, oh, the government is losing money, so we cannot afford social programs like education and healthcare. So it's a two-step process. You first cut taxes, and then you use the resulting deficit as an excuse to cut social programs. So in practice, when Republicans did try to tackle entitlement reforms, things like Social Security and Medicare, that proved to be very unpopular with the public. George W. Bush tried to do away with Social Security during his second term, and that did not go anywhere. Social Security, as you remember, is that federal retirement program, so it is beloved by old people, even conservative old people. Trump, in his first term, and he's talking about that for his second term, tried to do away with healthcare programs like Obamacare and Medicaid, and that so far did not go anywhere either. Many of his supporters are poor or working class, and they depend on such programs. So in practice, under Bush and Trump, we had large tax cuts without a significant drop in government spending, in fact, more spending on defense, and so that resulted in large deficits. And that would be a major difference between the modern conservative movement and the one from the Gilded Age or the 1920s, which was much more diligent about balancing the federal budget. Another way to measure the impact of tax cuts is GDP growth, i.e. how much the US economy produces from year to year. The GDP is a gross domestic product, how much the US economy is producing in a given year. And there the record is kind of mixed. You did have some solid economic growth under the Reagan administration and then initially in the Bush and Trump terms, but you also had some strong economic growth under other presidents like Obama and Clinton, both of whom raised taxes early in their presidency, and the end of the Bush and Trump presidencies were marked by major economic crisis. As far as the claim that a rising tide will lift all boats, that after cutting taxes for the rich, the wealth will somehow trickle down all the way to people at the bottom, there the answer is an emphatic no. The sharp rise in inequality that began in the 1980s has continued ever since to levels last seen during the Gilded Age or the 1920s. We live in an era of great income inequality. And I think this is one of the reasons that politics are so divisive nowadays. The income for most Americans has been flat or even declining over the long run, while the rich keep getting richer, and that undermines the American dream, the Horatio Algiers ideal that the next generation will be better off than the previous one. And if you are a millennial drowning under student debt, unable to buy a home or starting a family, while your boomer grandma is enjoying her retirement in style in Florida, well, then you know what I mean. As a general rule, our government tends to do things that benefit all people. Low taxes on 401ks, protecting Social Security and Medicare, and does little for young people, like fighting against the cost of college tuition, for example. Here's just one example. In 2020, during the great COVID pandemic, the US Congress twice passed a stimulus package that sent a check to every adult American, except to people under 25 who were still claimed on their parents' taxes. That was the law. So just to get this straight, all people who got Social Security checks every month and lost no income whatsoever during the COVID-19 pandemic, because, well, you can't be fired from being a retiree, well, they got their stimulus checks anyway. Meanwhile, a student at my university who had lost her job waitressing at the casino because everything was shut down, and who never had much money to begin with, well, because she's 20, well, she got no stimulus money. That seems unfair to me. And by the way, that stimulus was paid for by borrowing on a massive scale because the government was running a deficit. So who do you think will reimburse that national debt in the long run, decades from now? It is the 20-year-olds of today, not the 65-year-olds, obviously. And all that in the middle of a pandemic where the education and the finances of young people, or their mental well-being, were sacrificed to contain a disease that mostly affected the old, not the young. So to me, COVID was a great example of how current politics are skewed to benefit older generations at the expense of younger ones. And the reason is old people vote and politicians listen to them. And that brings me back yet again to my mantra in the class. If you want things to change, vote, because your grandma surely does. That growing inequality between the rich and the poor is a long-term trend. It was possible back in the 1960s for a blue-collar worker at an auto plant in Flint, Michigan, to raise his whole family on one salary, meaning a house, a couple cars in the driveway, and paying to send the kids to college, while his wife stayed at home as a homemaker. Well, nowadays, that auto worker most likely would not have a job anymore because Flint has been ravaged by job cuts in the auto industry. That worker instead will probably have some lower-paying job that is non-union. And his wife will also be working to pay the bills, and the kids will have to borrow to go to college and can't afford a home. So there's a sense of decline for many Americans, which is a result of the political choices of the last 40 years, which has soured the mood of the country. This is a nice segue to what I think is the main development of the past 20 years, how sharply polarized and bitter our politics have become. When I first moved to the US in the mid-1990s, people often voted a split ticket, i.e. a Democrat for the House of Representatives, a Republican for the Senate, and a Democrat for president, and so forth. And they might change from one election to the other. The two parties were not that far apart on many ideas, and people were more willing to entertain other ideas in general. Nowadays, those swing voters are far fewer. People are hardcore Democrats or hardcore Republicans, and they vote a straight party ticket election after election. Let's look at the approval rate of presidents in this chart. People used to judge them based on their accomplishment, even if that president was from another party. In other words, a president like Dwight D. Eisenhower could be popular with Democrats even if they did not vote for him. But now, there's a huge partisan divide by political affiliation. If you're a Republican, you'll judge a Republican president highly, no matter what this president does. And if you're a Democrat, you will never, ever accept that a Republican president could do a good job. And this is what this graph shows. The line indicates the partisan gap in approval ratings, and you can see how much higher that partisan gap is now than before the 1980s. Politics have become tribal. Part of the reason for this growing partisan divide is that the Republican Party has shifted sharply to the right, which makes it more difficult for a moderate Democrat to vote Republican from time to time, and vice versa. There is now a true difference in the agendas of the two parties, from guns to abortion to taxes to healthcare, so voters will stick to their side. I would also attribute rising partisanship to the development of the internet and cable TV. Back in the 60s, everybody watched Walter Cronkite on CBS on the nightly news because people had few media options, the press and a few channels. They might be arguing with the opinions of Walter Cronkite, and they did, but at least they watched the same broadcast and they agreed on the same basic facts. Nowadays, in response to complaints about the liberal bias of the mainstream media, conservatives have migrated to Rush Limbaugh and daytime radio, or Tucker Carlson on Fox News, or whatever meme your uncle is posting on Facebook, or whatever bro podcast that your brother is listening to. Meanwhile, some young people might be listening to an liberal influencer on YouTube or TikTok and getting some very, very different news. So not only do people disagree about opinions, which is one thing, but they also disagree about basic facts. I first noticed that in 2003 when my conservative students became convinced that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11. It was not the case. Osama bin Laden was behind 9/11, but Fox News said so to justify the Iraq War, and I could not convince my students otherwise. By the time Donald Trump was inaugurated in 2017 for his first term, people could look at something as simple as a picture of the National Mall on Inauguration Day, and some would say that this was the largest crowd ever, while others said, well, no, look at this picture. Obama's crowd was much larger. We could not even agree on the same picture, which was right in front of our eyes. So politics, as a result, are no longer about working across the aisle to pass a bipartisan bill, which used to be pretty common in US politics, or at least waiting patiently for 4 years for the next election to get your turn to run the country. Instead, politics are about scorched earth opposition to whatever the current president does, even if that means destroying the country in the process. But at least you get to own the libs, I guess. So how can you document this growing sense of partisanship as a historian? What were the main milestones? Let's go back to the narrative as a timeline. Well, personally, I would trace these types of scorched earth policies to the late 90s, when Bill Clinton had an affair with one of his aides, Monica Lewinsky. By itself, cheating on your wife is not a crime. It's immoral, to be sure, especially with a young co-worker, but it's not necessarily a crime. But Bill Clinton, who had legal training and should have known better, was stupid enough to lie about it under oath, and that is perjury. Cheating on your wife, not illegal. Lying under oath, that is illegal. So the Republicans in the House of Representatives, who had been trying for years to dig scandals about Bill Clinton and his wife Hillary, jumped on that opportunity and passed an impeachment resolution, the first since Andrew Johnson after the Civil War. If you're not familiar with impeachment, this is how it works. If a public official, like the president, commits a crime that is serious enough, then the House of Representatives, one of the chambers of Congress, can vote to, quote, impeach him, formally accuse him of that crime, like a grand jury would. And then the other chamber of Congress, the Senate, judges whether the president is actually guilty or not, the way a regular jury would. And if 2/3 of the Senate votes to convict, then the president is forcibly removed from office, which has never happened. Well, Bill Clinton was impeached by the House, but he was not convicted by the Senate, so he got to finish his second term. But a number of Democrats thought that the whole investigation had been a sham and that Republicans were just out to get him. So the seeds of distrust were planted. The next president was George Bush Jr., and in Democratic eyes, he was also illegitimate. Not just somebody you would disagree with on tax cuts and education and the war in Iraq, but somebody you think you should never have been president in the first place. This had to do with the bizarre circumstances of the 2000 election. Al Gore, the Democratic candidate, won the popular vote. He got more votes overall than George Bush. But bizarrely in the US, you don't become president just by getting more votes than the other guy. You win by winning more large states. It's called the Electoral College. So in the end, it all boiled down to Florida. If Gore or Bush won Florida, then they won the whole election. And that election happened to be extremely close in that state of Florida, with just a few hundred votes of difference out of millions cast. To make matters worse, many of these ballots were poorly designed, which added to the confusion. For some ballots, for example, you had to punch a hole in the punch card to cast your vote, but the cards did not work well, which left bits of papers, also known as chads, C-H-A-D, that were not fully punched. So the question was, if there was a hanging chad, did that count as a vote or not? All that may seem silly, but when you just have a few hundred votes to decide the whole U.S. election, that does matter. Election workers in Florida spent a whole month recounting the votes until the Supreme Court stepped in and said, let's just stop the recount, and whoever happens to be the current winner as of now will be the next president. And that happened to be George Bush. So ultimately, it's not just 500 votes in Florida that decided the matter, but 9 votes in the Supreme Court, or more specifically, just 1 vote, because the majority in the Supreme Court was only 5-4. And notice that those justices were appointed by previous presidents, including George Bush Sr., the father of the winning candidate, which seemed a bit odd. Not to mention that Jeb Bush, the brother of that candidate, was the one running the state of Florida and thus the election at the time. So Democrats cried bloody murder over the fact that the election was, to them, stolen by Bush and his cronies, and that no matter what, he had lost the popular vote, so he was illegitimate. Skip forward to the next president, 2008, and the election of Barack Obama. He clearly won the popular vote and the Electoral College, and then he did so again in his second term, 2012, so there's no question about the legitimacy of his election. But still, ugly rumors spread about him not being a natural-born citizen of the U.S., which is a requirement to run for president. Just to be clear, those rumors were factually inaccurate. They were false. Barack Obama was born in Hawaii, a state of the U.S., and yet a big chunk of the electorate were convinced that he was a Kenyan Muslim who should never have been president in the first place. His full name was Barack Hussein Obama, which did not help his case in his enemies' eyes. I would suggest, as a little digression, that maybe this obsession over whether Obama was a, quote, real American had something to do maybe with the color of his skin. And if you don't agree with me, here's a pop quiz. In the 2012 election between Barack Obama and John McCain, one of the 2 candidates was born in a U.S. state, and the other was born overseas. Which one? Well, let's see how many people know this information off the top of their head. The election of Obama was a watershed moment in U.S. history. He was the first mixed-race president in U.S. history, which showed that the country had made some important progress since 1865, the abolition of slavery, and 1965, the Voting Rights Act. He also saved the U.S. auto industry and got the country out of the Great Recession after 2008, and introduced a very important reform, Obamacare, that expanded healthcare coverage for the working poor. But today I'm focusing on the more modern conservative movement, so I want to skip straight through Obama's 2 terms to the next president in 26, Donald Trump, who was a Republican. I told you that Bill Clinton was controversial with the other party, so was George Bush, so was Barack Obama. Well, Trump was too. Partisanship definitely reached fever pitch under his administration. To begin with, there was again a situation where in 2016, the person who won the popular vote, the most votes, that would be Hillary Clinton, the Democratic candidate, was not the person who won the Electoral College and thus the presidency, and that would be Donald Trump. So that led to Democrats thinking of Trump as an illegitimate president, just like they saw George Bush back in the 2000 election, because he had not won a majority of the popular vote. Also, Democrats accused Trump of being a stooge of Vladimir Putin, the Russian dictator, so in 2020 they impeached him for colluding with Russia over aid to Ukraine. The Republican Senate voted to acquit, so Trump finished his term anyway. Moving on to the Trump re-election campaign in 2020, the Democratic candidate Joe Biden won the popular vote by a landslide and also the Electoral College, so his legitimacy could not be questioned, and yet somehow the losing candidate, so the incumbent Donald Trump, made unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud to argue that he had never truly lost. Trump filed numerous lawsuits, lost all of them, and then, despite all of this, sent in a mob to prevent Biden's election from being certified by Congress, which was truly unprecedented in U.S. history. Presidential succession normally is based on popular elections, not the rule of the mob. As a result, the House impeached Trump again, this time for violating the Constitution and unleashing the mob during an election. and the Republicans in the Senate acquitted him again. So we've reached a point where politics is a blood sport, where each camp supports their side no matter what. That's the culmination of a process that goes back at least 40 years. Notice how the Midwest is described by coastal Democrats as flyover country. Who cares about Nebraska? Meanwhile, Republicans describe the same areas as the heartland, the real America, while dismissing the big cities of the coast as dystopian hellholes that are somehow un-American. When you start arguing that the other side is not patriotic or not even real Americans, it is a dangerous, slippery slope, and that process started at least 40 years ago. Though Donald Trump was often described by his supporters and his opponents as a one-of-a-kind president, his policies during his first term were actually very much in line with the other conservatives of the past 40 years that we have discussed in this cycle of lectures. His economic agenda was about deregulation, especially for oil and coal, cutting taxes for the rich, and trying to repeal big government programs like Obamacare. Also, spending a lot of money on defense. Tax cuts, small government, the army, really nothing new there. It's standard republicanism. It did push for higher tariffs on imported goods, and did so even more so in the second term, which was more unusual because Republicans tend to be for free markets in general, and that includes free trade with other countries. So that's the difference right there. Trump also opposed immigration far more than his Republican predecessors. Other Republicans who are close to business interests tend to favor immigration traditionally because immigration brings cheap laborers to the U.S. job market for U.S. businesses. Whereas Trump and his supporters, who were more zealous about preserving traditional Americana, make America great again, were adamant about keeping out foreigners, especially those who looked different or prayed to a different god. So tariffs and immigration, two issues that were far more central to his agenda than that of traditional Republicans. More generally, Trump embraced wholeheartedly the flip side of the modern conservative movement, which would be the cultural wars. Not just small government and tax cuts, but also the cultural wars. He was and remains very adept at pushing hot-button issues such as opposing Blue Lives Matter, the anti-police violence campaign, or generally wokeism. His tone was also quite different from that of previous presidents, both Democrats and Republican, much more combative, even vulgar, especially when using tweets and social media. He did not just use subtle dog whistles. He openly supported neo-Nazis who were demonstrating in Charlottesville. Some of his so-called cultural wars were inconsequential. Sending a nasty tweet about a female politician at 5 a.m. may be unpresidential, but that won't really change a thing. In some other cases, the first Trump administration achieved lasting political change. For one thing, he got to appoint 3 new conservative Supreme Court justices during his term, and then they proceeded to repeal Roe v. Wade, the 1973 decision that had granted abortion rights across the U.S. That new decision that repealed Roe v. Wade, it's called Dobbs v. Jackson from 2022, that was a major development. It meant that now abortion rights were no longer protected at the federal level, so each state decided what to do about abortion. Some states kept abortion rights and even expanded them, while others restricted or even outright outlawed abortion altogether. Here in Louisiana, for example, as of 2025, when I'm taping this, abortion is illegal from the time of conception, even in a case like a minor being raped by her dad, for example. So that issue of abortion further divided the country between 2 camps, one half of the country that is pro-life and the other one pro-choice. Another important by the new Trump Supreme Court was a decision called Students for Fair Admission v. Harvard. That's from 2023. It made affirmative action illegal in universities. Affirmative action is a policy to give preference to certain minorities when selecting students who go to selective institutions like Harvard. That practice, which was controversial among white and Asian applicants, is now illegal under that decision. As a side note, I want to mention that another practice does remain legal.
when legacy students, meaning the kids of rich donors and alums, apply for Harvard, well, they still get a leg up when applying to such institutions. I personally don't like using race as a factor for admission, but I also don't like favoring some people due to their money and their connections either. I'm all in favor of making admission a level playing field, but all across the board. Okay, so courting neo-Nazis from Charlottesville or banning abortion, that scared away a lot of traditional country club Republicans, especially educated women in the suburbs, the more traditional version of Republicanism. But then at the same time, some Democrats embraced things of racial justice, like DEI, white guilt, Black Lives Matter, reparations, and that turned off many working class whites, especially men. Young white working class men who used to vote Democratic back in the days of FDR, well, now many of them will vote Republican as part of a backlash against what they perceived as a reverse discrimination against white men. So we got a switch in party affiliations and also a growing divide based on race and gender in politics. One party tends to perform very well among women and minorities, Democrats, while the other is disproportionately white and male, Republican. Another major divide, by the way, is education. A typical Democrat nowadays tends to be college educated, while Republicans poll very well among those who only went to high school. Another major divide in politics today is location. Some states are solidly blue, Democratic, think Massachusetts, while others are solidly red, Republican, think Idaho. Within those states, urban areas tend to attract the young, hip, educated class that leans left, while rural areas do the opposite, they lean conservative. So people don't just vote differently, nowadays they live in different areas of the country altogether. And they date and they marry their own as well. So a young liberal gay woman in rural Louisiana will not stick around Abbeville, Iowa. She will move to Austin, Texas to be around like-minded people. Meanwhile, a conservative in Orange County, California will flee from California and move to a conservative state like Idaho, where he will feel more at home. Living in different areas of the country has made politics even more tribal and partisan than they already are. Senators from solid red states or solid blue states are sure to be reelected. And in the House of Representatives, most districts nowadays are pretty safe. If you're a Democrat and your district is in downtown New York City or San Francisco, you will win for sure. If you're a Republican and your district is in rural Alabama or Wyoming, you're safe too. So you're not afraid of losing the election and you don't need to appeal to the other side. And that has been made worse by something called gerrymandering, and that's a practice by which politicians cut weird borders for their districts so as to put enough like-minded voters in their district to guarantee re-election term after term. So what does that mean? Well, first, most elections in America are pointless for most Americans. Locally, I tell you to vote, but your vote will not change much in a lot of elections because so many races are lopsided because the districts or even the states are so safe. Second impact, politicians in safe districts tend to embrace more radical platforms, far right or far left, because the only way that they can lose is if an even more radical member from their own party challenges them in the primary. They have no need to embrace moderate measures to appeal to swing voters in a general election because that one is safe. The primary is the only one that matters. So if you followed closely, we now have a country where people disagree sharply over major issues like abortion, tax cuts, and race, where people think that politicians on the other side are un-American or illegitimate, where people don't live next to each other, don't interact much with each other, don't get their facts from the same news sources, and in some cases are divided by race or gender or income or educational attainment. Oh, and they are also pissed about income inequality and a bevy of race-based grievances. And also their brains are fried by their cell phone use. What could go wrong? Well, I'm taping this in the spring of 2025 at the beginning of a second Trump administration. So far, he's not shown any desire to tone down his policies or appeal to the other side. Far from it. so I don't see the partisan divide ebb away anytime soon. As a historian, I can only retrace the distant past, because the recent past is still too unsettled to pass judgment on. And as for the future, well, it has not happened yet. As a historian, I can't talk about that. But the current situation is looking uncertain, to say the least. Stay tuned. All right, I hate to leave the class on that troublesome note. We started 130 years ago in the aftermath of a civil war at a time when the country was very divided and trying to mend its wounds, and it's as if we're on the eve of another civil war now. Still, we've seen America go through some difficult times, 2 world wars, a Great Depression, defeat in Vietnam, and always pull through, right? So let's be like Ronald Reagan and keep our sunny optimism no matter what. Things will get better, right? Well, that's it for this slide, and this lecture, and this section, and the whole class. I have run out of history to tell for now, so I gotta stop. Au revoir, and goodbye.